Hello and welcome to another episode of Casting Views, the podcast that takes a topic each week and, as the name suggests, casts views. This week I'm absent of guests. I don't have a guest with me. I'm flying solo, so I thought I'd take the opportunity to have another dive into a subject that's been lingering on my idea board for a while and wasn't sure how to put it into a conversation. So you're going to hear about that today. But before we get stuck into it, normally this will be the part of the episode where I play a trailer from some friends of the show. But rather than a trailer, I'm actually just going to talk about a bunch of friends of the show. I have been fortunate to be included as a member in the PodPack Collective. So if you don't know who we are a group of podcasters basically dedicated to promoting positivity within the indie podcasting community itself. I'm going to list off, at the time of recording, the current members, just for me to say these people are really good people, both on a personal level. So we've got a chat channel where we can ask for support or basically just be there to support each other. But they're also great podcasters. So if you're not checking them out, go give them a listen, go give them a like and a subscribe and say I sent you, say hi for me. The other podcasters involved are Chat Tsunami, the Nerdstalgic podcast, Two Girls, One Reusable Cup, Review It Yourself, Seismic Cinema, Stop, Drop and Roll Initiative, and Weird Horizons. So yeah, like I said, hi to all of them. So the topic of this episode is going to be doppelgangers and mistaken identities. Now, it all stemmed from an article which I'll relay to you at the end of the episode about a guy who bumped into an exact doppelganger in a number of ways, actually, which then led me on to mistaken identities, but then just the whole thing about lookalikes alone. I guess before we can discuss doppelgangers, what makes a doppelganger, and also just hearing myself, how many times am I going to say doppelganger in this? So maybe we'll come back at the end of the episode with a count. A doppelganger is a double or someone that looks exactly like someone else but is biologically unrelated. In fiction and mythology, a doppelganger is often portrayed as a ghostly or paranormal phenomenon and is usually seen as a harbinger of bad luck. And other traditions and stories equate a doppelganger with an evil twin. In modern times, the term twin stranger is occasionally used, and the word doppelganger itself is a loan word from the German noun doppelganger, literally meaning double walker. So the first thing I was thinking about is, what are the odds that there is someone walking around that looks exactly like you? Doing some digging around on the internet, most places seem to point towards one specific study back in 2015. And I'm going to take the majority of that from an article about that posted on the BBC website back in 2016. As it starts, in 2015, biologist Tegan Lucas from the University of Adelaide in Australia, she set out on a task to test the risk of mistaking an innocent person as a double for a killer. Armed with a public collection of photographs of US military personnel and the help of colleagues from the university, she analysed the faces of nearly 4,000 individuals, measuring the distances between 8 key features such as the eyes and ears. Next, she set about calculating the probability that two people's faces would match. What she found was good news for the criminal justice system, but likely to disappoint anyone hoping to easily bump into their long-lost double. She calculated the chances of sharing 8 features with someone else are less than 1 in a trillion. And with 7.4 billion people on the planet, that's a 1 in 135 chance that there's a single pair of doppelgangers. However, the chances of finding a doppelganger become even slimmer when Dr. Lucas analysed the rest of the body for similarities. She adds, if we look at measurements of the body, the chance is even lower at 1 in a quintillion based on 8 measurements. This is because those measurements are larger and thus have a larger range, which means there is less chance for people to match each other. So, in Dr. Lucas's findings, far from everyone having a long-lost twin, it's more likely that no one does. But as always, there's a bit more to it than that. The study relied on exact measurements. If your doppelganger's ears measure 59mm but yours are 60, it wouldn't count as a likeness. In any case, you probably won't remember the last time you clocked an uncanny resemblance based on the length of someone's ears alone. There may be another way, and it all comes down to what you mean by a doppelganger. David Aldous, a statistician at UC Berkeley, says, it depends whether we mean lookalike to a human or lookalike to facial recognition software. So, yeah, now we've got computers analysing us for both security reasons and access to places, and even on the phone. So, we're starting to get into different levels now of exact likeness and what that should be. Francois Brunel, who has photographed over 200 pairs of doubles for his project I'm Not a Lookalike, says, for me, it's when you see someone and you think it's the other person. When seen apart, his subjects look like perfect clones. When you get them together and you see them side by side, sometimes you feel they are not the same at all. Now, that last comment got me thinking about the fact that people apart, you might think they look like one another, and together there may be a difference. Maybe not quite fitting that mould, but always brings me to mind of my dad. My dad, I've mentioned on here before, was born in Italy, his family all Italian. And he had, to many people, and including me, an exact doppelganger of himself as a TV presenter in Italy, on Italian TV, ironically. Now, the funny thing was, when I used to look at my dad, I wouldn't see that presenter. I wouldn't say, oh, he looks like that TV presenter. But when I looked at that TV presenter, it was exactly like my dad. The mannerisms of face, it was incredible. And it was so much so that when we went on holiday, if we weren't going to his hometown, people would stop stare and on a couple of occasions would shout out to him that he was that TV presenter. So again, if we'd have managed to get them in the same room together, I wonder what we would have thought. But yeah, it is incredible. Looked to my dad, didn't see the presenter. Looked to the presenter, it was my dad. I just thought that was an apt opportunity to kind of bring up that story with that comment from Francois Brunel. Carrying on, if the fine details aren't important, suddenly the possibility of having a lookalike looks a lot more realistic. But is it really true? So to find out, we need to get to grips with what goes on when we recognise a familiar face. This article mentions that there was an illusion of Bill Clinton and Al Gore which circulated the internet before their re-election in 1997. That illusion featured a picture of the two men standing side by side, but on closer inspections, you can see that Gore's internal facial features, so his eyes, nose and mouth, have actually been replaced by Bill Clinton's. So even without those traits, with his underlying facial structure intact, Al Gore looks completely normal. It's a striking demonstration of the way faces are stored in the brain, more like a map than an image. So when you bump into a friend on the street, the brain immediately sets to work recognising their features such as hairline and skin tone. This article says individually it's like recognising Italy by its shape alone. But this then got me thinking a little bit more about how the brain recognises faces. Now, to ensure faces can be recognised in any context, the brain employs an area known as, and apologies here for the pronunciation of this, an area called the fusiform gyrus to tie all the pieces together. If you compare it to finding a country on a map, this is like checking it has a border with France or a coastline. The holistic sum of the parts perception is thought to make recognising people a lot more accurate than it would be if we assessed features alone and in isolation. Crucially, it also fudges the importance of some of the subtler details. Nick Filer, a statistician involved in a computer-aided facial recognition project, says most people concentrate on superficial characteristics such as hairline, hairstyle and eyebrows. Other research has shown that we look to the eyes, mouth and nose in that order. Once you take that into account, then it's just a matter of working out the probability that someone else will have all the same versions of those as you. Winrick Frywald, who studies face perception at Rockefeller University, says there are only so many genes in the world which specify the shape of the face and millions of people, so it's bound to happen at some point. For somebody with an average face, it's comparatively easy to find good matches. So, for example, let's assume we have a man who has short blonde hair, brown eyes, a fleshy nose, a round face, and a full beard. Research into the prevalence of these features is hard to come by, and you can't equate it globally. But according to some research, he's off to a promising start, with 55% of the global population having brown eyes. Meanwhile, more than 1 in 10 people have round faces, and that was according to research by a cosmetics company. Then there's the nose. A study of photographs taken in Europe has identified the fleshy type as the most prevalent at 24.2%. Finally, hair. If you thought hair was too frivolous feature for investigation, you'd be wrong. Among 24,300 people surveyed at a Florida theme park, 82% of men had hair shorter than shoulder length. Natural blondes, however, constitute just 2%. And as the beard capital of the world, in the UK, most men have some form of facial hair and nearly 1 in 6 have a full beard. So a simple calculation for this website, but a simple calculation of the above, so male, brown eyes, blonde, round face, fleshy nose, short hair and a full beard, reveals the probability of a person possessing all of those features is just over 1 in 100,000. Again, according to this article, this would give our person no less than 74,000 potential doppelgangers. It's possible then that most people have a doppelganger, but everyone? David Aldous, he says there's a big difference between being lucky sometimes and being lucky always. So indeed, it might never be possible to say definitively, since the perception of facial resemblance is subjective. Some people, for example, have trouble recognising themselves in photos, while others rarely forget a face. And how we perceive similarity is heavily influenced by familiarity. Some doubles, when they get together, they say, "No, I don't see it. Really, I don't." But it's so obvious to everyone else. It's crazy to hear that, says Francois Brunel, following his study. Even so, Filer thinks there's a good chance. I think most people have somebody who is a facial lookalike, unless they have a truly exceptional and unusual face, he says. Frywald agrees, saying, "I think in the digital age which we are entering, at some point we will know someone because there will be pictures of almost everyone online." And we've said on this podcast a number of times the amount of personal information now and photographs of people out there. Are we going to be more likely to see someone that we think we recognise as being somebody else? Taking all the above, it's just to conclude by saying at Dr. Lucas's studies, if we're talking about the measurements of the face, there is a 1 in a trillion chance that 2 or more people will match one another on 8 measurements. But if we take in wider measurements of the body, it's 1 in a quintillion. However, the other thing that cropped up when I was doing some of this research is that there can be disorders that make people believe in doppelgangers. So it's not just purely the fact that 2 people may look the same. So there were 2 that I've picked up on in particular. So the first one is called I believe it's pronounced the Capgras delusion. This is also known as the imposter syndrome. So it is a psychological condition where an individual irrationally believes that an identical looking imposter has replaced someone they know. They may believe that a family member or even their romantic partner has been replaced by a doppelganger. Unlike other conditions of the mind, Capgras delusion doesn't affect other aspects of your life except the belief that an imposter has replaced your loved one. People with this disorder believe the imposter looks exactly like the actual person and only they can identify the disguise of the imposter. Another variant of this is the Fregoli syndrome. This can also make some people believe in the existence of doppelgangers. It is a rare disorder that makes someone believe that different individuals are actually the same person who constantly change their disguise or appearance. According to a 2006 study, people with misidentification syndromes like Fregoli tend to have identifiable brain lesions, especially in the right frontoparietal and adjacent regions in considerable proportions. So that just goes to show how, the idea of doppelgangers can also be a medical condition. So Having taken all that in, I'm going to loop round to the story I mentioned at the start and probably what was the kickstart for this episode theme. It was a story from either earlier this year or last year about a guy from England who met his exact doppelganger on a flight. But more than that, there were so many other similarities involved. So I've taken this from a number of news articles. Roughly, the story goes, a man was stunned recently to discover his doppelganger seated next to him on an airline flight. Not only did they look alike, they found out they had the same names, hobbies, and even a mutual friend. Mark Garland, 58, a bus driver from Trowbridge, Bristol, was checking in at the airport when staff told him he had already checked in. After about 40 minutes deliberation, they finally worked out there were in fact two Mark Garlands on the same flight. But the similarities didn't end there. The two men met in departures, and when they did come face to face, they realised they looked remarkably similar, both wearing black and both with an identical shaved head. But the coincidences still continued. When Mark got to his seat on the plane, he found out he had been allocated a seat right next to the other Mark Garland. The younger Mark spent 11 and a half hours chatting to the other one, a 62-year-old builder from Warmley. On chatting, they discovered they lived just 15 miles apart, and the builder Mark sometimes even got on the same bus route as the younger Mark. Both of the men had 4 kids, are currently single, and they even have a friend in common. A colleague of the younger Mark drinks with Mark the elder at his local pub. And along with all that, they both have an absolute love for Thailand, having visited the country more than a dozen times each. So for me, stories like that just capture my imagination like anything, because these two men, the chance of them just meeting and being sat on the same, well, not on the same plane, but next to each other on the plane. But the fact that they live 50 miles apart, have the same name, pretty much similar life in terms of the kids and their marital status, being single, but also sharing a friend. It's incredible. There was another story I found. We're going back a little bit, and by a little bit, we're going back to 1895. This is a story concerning Adolf Beck and John Smith. So the story goes that on the evening of the 16th December 1895, 54-year-old Adolf Beck stepped out of his London home to be confronted by an unknown woman who accused him of stealing her jewellery 3 weeks earlier. He denied the allegation but fled the scene when she started to call him a thief. The woman, Ottilie Maisonnier, chased after him until they met a police officer who took them to the Rochester Row police station. Officers at the station matched the robbery to that reported by another woman, Daisy Grant, a few months earlier. They invited both Daisy and Maisonnier's maid, who had supposedly seen Beck when he defrauded her mistress, to identify him in a lineup of 7 men. The women all pointed to Beck as being the thief. After newspapers reported the incident, more women came forward with similar accusations and identified Beck as the criminal. He was subsequently recognised by different women when standing in lineups of 8, 14 and 18 men. A handwriting specialist even studied Beck's writing and claimed that it was a modified version of the one he used for fraud. Beck stood trial and was sentenced to prison for 7 years. Released in 1901, he remained a free man until 1904 when another woman accused him of stealing her jewellery. More women accused him of similar crimes and even identified him from several lineups, and Beck was sentenced to prison for another 5 years. This time, however, luck shone his way as the real criminal was caught 10 days into Beck's second imprisonment. The lookalike was a man who called himself John Smith, even though his real name was believed to be Frederick Mayer. Beck and Smith looked alike, but not so much that they couldn't be differentiated. Yet 16 women misidentified Beck as Smith. Beck was freed and given £5,000 for his sufferings. Meanwhile, Smith was sent to prison, and the incident changed British criminal law and is the reason that suspects are not convicted based on eyewitness counts alone. So what I find interesting about that case is, if we go right back to Dr. Lucas's study, it was carried out to find out the possibility of mistaking someone for a criminal, And then we get to the fact of it being 1 in a trillion, I think it was, or 1 in a quintillion if you took in bigger. Yeah, it was 1 in a trillion chance that two people could look the same. Yet this person here, unfortunately, twice on 2 occasions was mistaken for a criminal. And the last story I had it's not necessarily mistaken identities, but it then also got me thinking. I love hearing those stories where celebrities enter a lookalike competition and they don't win. And it's kind of always urban legends, you know, that you don't know if they're true or not. And I did find one about Charlie Chaplin where it was reported in a paper in Singapore in 1920, where the story goes, Charlie Chaplin was one day at a fair in the United States where there was an attraction of a competition as to who could best imitate the Charlie Chaplin walk. The real Charlie Chaplin thought there might be a chance for him, so he entered the performance minus his celebrated moustache and boots. It was a frightful failure and came in 20th. Now, Jeffrey Vance, a writer of Chaplin Genius of the Cinema, also clarified that he found an interview where Charlie Chaplin himself said in 1966, it wasn't true, had no basis in fact. I'm working hard all day, I certainly don't want to do that. Which brings me almost to the end, and I say almost because I have got one personal story, and this was from many years ago. I was in a local newsagent, had a rack of papers and magazines. I was looking at a magazine, had my back to the shop, and all of a sudden I feel a really sharp, really painful pain in my right buttock. Yep, the right buttock. I spin around and there was a woman smiling and laughing. And then when I turned around, the look of sort of amusement quickly turned. She'd covered her mouth and she goes, oh my God, I'm really sorry. I thought you were my boyfriend. So obviously from behind, I was a doppelganger for her boyfriend. What I wanted to say before she kind of ran off in embarrassment was that gesture she did wasn't quite as romantic as she thought it was. It was more on the painful side. But it's probably the only occasion where I think I've been mistaken for someone else. So yeah, as I sign off, I kind of want to say I hope you've enjoyed this episode. If you believe you look like someone, if you've been told you look like someone, let me know. You can get me at Casting Views across all social media, or drop me a note, an email at castingviewspod@gmail.com. Once again, just a shout out to the PodPack Collective, who I named at the start, and I will see you next week for another episode of Casting Views.
1, 2, 3, 4. If I want your opinion, I will give it to you. Come on, take what we've got, 'cause you need it. Don't make us get a spark and proceed it. Come on.